Hey, welcome to the podcast. I am your host, Jordan Ramirez. Since we are getting close to the Christmas and holiday season this December, I thought, wouldn't it be nice not just to talk about some of my favorite films on the podcast, but films that are Christmas or holiday themed that one can share? I can give you a few of my favorite holiday or Christmas themed examples that I am sure everyone, or maybe not everyone, is familiar with. Take Miracle on 34th Street, for example. Now, everyone has either seen the original 1947 film airing on TV every Christmas because the story is very familiar. It's about a man named Kris Kringle who is working as a mall Santa at Macy's, and the employer believes that the man is delusional and crazy into thinking that he is actually Santa Claus, but that he also helps Natalie Wood in the film by compelling her to use her imagination, which is something that she has not been able to do. It is a timeless classic that has been remade, referenced, or even spoofed on some occasions. I remembered seeing this film either on VHS or on television years ago in the late 1990s and 2000s decade. At the time I saw this film, I didn't remember too much about the story since it was something that flew over my head. What I started to learn about the film was the fact that this was a thinly veiled satire about the commercialization of Christmas, and that Santa Claus from the North Pole was trying to convey a message that was meant to reinforce the notion that commercialism is destroying the true meaning of Christmas. That was according to the screenwriter Terence Davies when he wrote the story one day as he was shopping at Macy's. This information was from the AMC Hollywood Backstories episode that aired in the early 2000s decade. Another Christmas film that I would share with you is something that I would consider one of my favorites of an offbeat nature, Santa Claus from 1959. It is an unusual film all on its own. So the story is about Santa Claus, who in this film lives in a castle above the clouds with all of his workers being children from other nations in their own little stereotypical environment. While at the Earth's core, Satan has sent one of his devils, Pitch, to battle against Santa Claus to make sure all of the kids on Earth are naughty as some sort of way to own their souls. It's a bizarre story that is meant to be made for children in Mexico since the country is not familiar with the mythology of Santa Claus. It creates its own mythology of the famous fictitious character as if he were some sort of demigod spiritual-like figure on Christmas. I first saw this film on the comedy program Mystery Science Theater 3000, and I was taken by the film's premise and the offbeat set design and prop pieces inside Santa Claus's castle. The film was made by Churubusco Studios in Mexico and was dubbed and marketed by K. Gordon Murray. Now, he was known for taking these offbeat Mexican movies in nature and exploiting them as if they were made to look like Disney films. The other element of what makes this film so offbeat is the English dubbing for the characters in the film that makes them sound cartoonish and further enhances the surreal factor. I would put these films as honorable mentions or films that are worth mentioning for the Christmas holiday season. It's a Wonderful Life, Elf, A Christmas Story, The Santa Claus, The Polar Express, A Christmas Vacation, etc. Not because I don't like these films, but because these films are shown every Christmas or holiday season year in and year out. For the next episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez before the end of the new year, it will be a special mailbag or recommendation episode. So instead of a single film that I recommend, this episode will feature some recommended Christmas and holiday movies from you, the listener. You can submit your favorite recommended Christmas/holiday movie for the upcoming mailbag/recommendation episode. Make sure to put in your recommendations at my Instagram page at Jordan Ramirez 268 or on the Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez Facebook page. You can also send in your questions about the show, like the upcoming season, new episodes, and you as the guest star. It's going to be a bit of a breather for the next upcoming episode. So instead of a mini-sode starting on Monday next week, it will be just a mailbag episode with just your questions and Christmas holiday recommendations that will be read on the air. Make sure to tune in to that episode, that they will be mentioned as soon as possible. So, without further ado, today's film review is The Deep Blue Sea from 2011, followed by my segment, Allow Me to Explain. And now, as they say, on with the show. This is Jordan Ramirez, and you are listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. And now, here is my latest film review. My film review for this episode is The Deep Blue Sea, released in 2011, directed by Terence Davies, starring Rachel Weisz, Tom Hiddleston, and Simon Russell Beale. Hester Collier, played by Rachel Weisz, is the wife of William Collier, played by Simon Russell Beale, a judge. Hester's marital relationship with her husband has been passionless. One day, she falls in love with Freddie Page, played by Tom Hiddleston, a former RAF pilot. Just when Hester thought that her relationship with Freddie was going so well, it has driven her to the point of suicide. It's a love relationship that is on the verge of collapse. So what do I think of this film? To be completely honest, even though the subject of the film is depressing and dark, I still love the performances, set design, cinematography, costume design, and the use of orchestral score to navigate through the dark and bleak aspects of this melodrama. Rachel Weisz's performance is wrought with emotional detachment from her first husband, whom she is unhappy with in their marital status, and becomes overjoyed with Freddie Page, played by Tom Hiddleston. She conveys a calm and quiet demeanor, whether it's between her husband William Collier or with Freddie Page. When she does confront her husband about the secretive affair that she has with Freddie, it's very calm and controlled without any usage of violent or hyper-emotional rhetoric that would convey the uneasiness that is shown in that sequence. Later in the story, when Freddie finds a note that was written by Hester, he starts to convey anger and frustration that he thinks that she has driven herself to attempted suicide because he doesn't love her back. Hiddleston's performance I found to be enjoyable. When he is introduced to Hester at a hotel and then they later meet at a bar and have a few drinks and talk, it becomes optimistic and charming, up to the point that they end up making love in bed in one risque and racy sequence. He starts out as being funny and jovial with his best friend Jackie Jones, whom they were both fighter pilots for the RAF during World War II. I find their scenes to be the most engaging, which is what made me think that they could have been a great comedic duo in this story. One thing that I would mention for those who have yet to see this film is the use of color palettes in set design and costuming. The colors in the film are muted, like light grays in the costumes, or bright colors like greens and reds and light or dark blues. But I also have to take appreciation for Davies' use of flashbacks to help convey to us how Hester ended up in this current situation. The composition of the mise-en-scène and the framing of the characters in each sequence, whether it is outside of a pub or inside Freddie's apartment, are remarkable. This is the second film adaptation of Terence Ratigan's stage play that first opened in 1952. The first film adaptation of the story was from 1955, with Vivien Leigh and Kenneth More as the couple. The Deep Blue Sea marked Terence Davies' return to narrative filmmaking for more than 10 years. His last feature film before directing this one was the film adaptation of Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth in 2000. Davies, in an interview, stated the reason for this gap. "We don't really have a film industry in England. It's a cottage industry. At one time we did have a strong proper industry. Now every new orthodoxy comes in, and if you don't fit that orthodoxy, then no one's interested. There's this constant of, will Americans like it? And what we get is endless things in the 30s or Jane Austen. I don't know how anyone can find those interesting at all. It's got nothing to do with the way Britain was, particularly in the 30s. I remember someone sending me a script by Jane Austen and the opening sequence was, this maid comes down with a jug of water and drops the water. And I said, well, she wouldn't have a jug of water. She'd be emptying the pots from the night before. This would be urine and feces. They said, we can't do that. I said, why not? They don't go to the toilet in Jane Austen? They said, no, they don't. Oh, I wonder how they managed it. It's that sort of nonsense, and also the same group of people giving the same performances year in and year out. It is so debilitating. I'm just not interested in it. When you're not in the mainstream, and I cast people I think can do it, not because of their names, that's also becoming more and more difficult. The worst thing is the orthodoxy, and it changes all the time. So you're constantly 2 orthodoxies behind. People just weren't interested. So I thought, oh well, that's it. After 8 years, I can't get anything off the ground. That's it. Curtains. And that's what I did think. Terence Ratigan's estate, the Ratigan Trust, got in touch with Terence Davies since it marked what could have been Terence Ratigan's 100th birthday. And of course, the Trust wanted to have a film made of his work because there was a revival of his plays. Producer Sean O'Connor ended up asking Terence Davies about adapting any one of Ratigan's plays into a feature film. Terence Davies: I said, I don't want to do the Browning version because the Anthony Asquith version is so good. I didn't want to do separate tables because the Burt Lancaster Delbert Mann version from the end of the 50s is also very good. So I read the whole canon and I thought I could do something with the Deep Blue Sea. That's what happened. The UK Film Council ended up funding the film project and put in £1 million for the budget, with a secondary budget worth £2.5 million coming in from other people. Once Davies had chosen the play for his next project, the next hurdle was the adaptation of Ratigan's stage play into a workable script. Terence Davies: My only concern along those lines is that he puts all the exposition in the first act. The exposition in the first act of The Deep Blue Sea is not very convincing. He clearly never lived in this sort of place just after the war, so that was weak, I thought. But I thought, if I just do it from Hester's point of view, we can show how we got there. Once I decided that, it made it relatively easy to open the play out and put in things that are actually not there in the play. In order to make it her story, it meant cutting down some of the supporting characters quite a bit. Opening it up meant taking a little bit of the action outside, or into a pub, things like that. Going to the art gallery, going to see his mother, all those things felt natural. All those things helped, and they are all a result of doing it from Hester's point of view. The design and look of the sets and costumes in the film was something that Terence Davies wanted to test before filming started, to explain to the heads of either the costume department or the set department of how he wanted the film to look and how it should be well properly lit to get the atmosphere of the story. Davies wanted to find the right color palettes for the dark and drabby interiors of the film to echo the bleak and pessimistic environment of the story, along with the costumes worn by the characters. Terence Davies, who rarely went to the movies when it came to casting choices for his project, said, "One night I was having trouble reading, so I started watching television, and Swept from the Sea by Beeben Kidron was playing, and when Rachel Weisz came on the screen, she had this wonderful luminosity and wonderful eyes, and I thought she was just really wonderful. I have never seen her before, and I asked my casting director who she was and found out she was Rachel Weisz, and so I asked if we could send it to her and see if she'd do it. So we did, and later she rang to me. I told her I had no idea where I would take her in this role, but still, she said she'd do it." From there, the casting moved on from Rachel Weisz to Simon Russell Beale, whom Terence Davies had seen him on television as well and thought that he would be great in the film. So Simon Russell Beale was sent the script, came in to see the director, and they both had a lively conversation. Beale would read a sonnet, they both talked about musicals, and Davies asked Beale if he would be involved in the project. He said yes. The other cast members to join the film include Tom Hiddleston as Freddie Page, Harry Hayden Patton as Jackie Jackson, and Ann Mitchell as Mrs. Elton. Once the script was prepared and the cast was all set, production began. The shooting lasted for 25 days in late 2010. Filming locations took place in Buckinghamshire and London and the 3 Mill Studios in Bow, England. Their post-production schedule lasted from 6 to 9 weeks to edit and cut the film. The film premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival on September 11, 2011. It was later released in the United Kingdom on November 25, 2011 on a limited release. It was released in the United States as a limited release on March 23, 2012. Critical reception to the film were mostly positive. The critical reception was also warm to the performance by Rachel Weisz, who won a Best Actress award at the 2012 New York Film Critics Circle Awards and another Best Actress award from the Toronto Film Critics Association. It was chosen as one of the top 10 films of the year by the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. The film may look bleak and pessimistic in nature as a British tragic melodrama, but it's got great performances by the lead actors, a wonderful story, brilliant direction, and the set design and costuming that makes it a wonderful film to enjoy. When it comes to romantic films, there are 2 types of stories: successful love stories and unsuccessful love stories. This film is in the latter category, that is often seen in film genres like crime stories, thrillers, comedies, etc. Even though the film is not everyone's cup of tea, it's still worth watching if one is a fan of melodramas and tragic love stories. I would highly recommend this film since it has the feel and look of a post-war melodrama from the 1950s decade. But if you don't like this film, then it's your choice. We will be right back with my segment, Allow Me to Explain. In an underseen court case that has barely been a blip in the news cycle, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments for the case known as SEC versus Jarkessi. And even though this court case had not been receiving the attention-grabbing headlines or enough news coverage on the major broadcast networks, there is still enough reason and concern that this court case will literally blow up the functions of the United States government as we know it. It's time for Allow Me to Explain. The Supreme Court last week heard the oral arguments of SEC versus Jarkessi. Whether you think that this court was going to make things better for the agency, right now it doesn't look good. This case stemmed from the court case that was brought before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in 2022. The decision would have hobbled the agency outright. The agency was part of the New Deal from the Roosevelt administration that was tasked with protecting investors from fraud. Part of that court's decision used the language from the former president that would have replaced much of the federal employees in those agencies with loyalists if he was reelected. The Fifth Circuit managed to use for one of its arguments is the defunct legal doctrine known as non-delegation, which would strip federal agencies of their authority when it came to making discretionary decisions. But that argument was barely mentioned at the oral argument in the Supreme Court. Even before this case was brought before the Supreme Court this year, you can argue that this stemmed all the way back during the campaign of President Reagan back in 1981 when he was inaugurated. Ali Velshi talked about it in the segment of his show last week.
Ronald Reagan's key campaign promises upon assuming the presidency in 1981 was to reduce the size and influence of the federal government and to promote deregulation in order to stimulate the economy. Today, the so-called administrative state, this is what is used derogatorily, is a huge piece of our federal governing system. Under the executive branch, there are 15 departments: Department of State, Treasury, Interior, Education, Agriculture, Justice, Commerce. They go on. And within those departments, there are more than 400 agencies and sub-agencies that employ 2 million Americans. Now, these agencies, among other functions, are the regulatory bodies upon which we rely in nearly every aspect of our daily lives. Experts at the EPA regulate pollutants. The Department of Transportation comes up with safety standards for cars and highways. Agriculture makes sure our food is safe. FDA determines the drugs we consume. OSHA and the Department of Labor keep workers safe. They protect their rights. This big, complex nation has big, complex systems to keep it running. But for decades, even before Reagan gave that speech, there have been debates about the size of government and the democratic nature of accountability, often in conservative circles. In 2018, as Trump had already appointed an historic number of federal judges, including his first Supreme Court pick, Neil Gorsuch, who had a long history of opposing federal regulations. The White House counsel, Don McGahn, said in plain terms exactly what the Trump administration was going to do. Quote, there is a coherent plan here where actually the judicial selection and the deregulatory effect are really the flip side of the same coin. With courts stacked with Trump appointees across the country, the coherent plan was well underway. The Supreme Court has taken up 3 major cases this term that take aim at the very structure of the so-called administrative state and at the constitutionality of how they function. These cases on their own, but especially together, will call into question the function of our government as we know it. Today, we're focusing on one of those cases, SEC versus Jarkessi. In short, George Jarkessi is a right-wing activist and political commentator who is also a hedge fund manager. He got in trouble with the Securities and Exchange Commission for fraud. The SEC found that he misrepresented how his funds were run, that he paid himself and his partner excessive fees, that he inflated his assets' value. The SEC responded in a very standard way, fining him and prohibiting him from certain kinds of investment work. Jarkessi contested the SEC's ruling, but he didn't stop there. He argued that the SEC's entire regulatory process, including the role of administrative law judges, was unconstitutional. SEC versus Jarkessi and the other 2 cases taken up by the Supreme Court take aim at the powers of the so-called administrative state and at the very functioning of our government. They attack the constitutionality of how agencies are funded. They attack Congress's ability to delegate responsibilities to the agencies, and they attack the constitutionality of how agencies are allowed to adjudicate matters. Just last year, the Supreme Court ruled against the EPA in a decision that severely limited agencies' regulatory power. In that case, the EPA's ability to regulate carbon dioxide. Justice Elena Kagan wrote in the dissent in support of the EPA, saying that the court, quote, does not have a clue, I'll read it here, does not have a clue about how to address climate change, yet it appoints itself, instead of Congress or the expert agency, the decision maker on climate policy. I cannot think of many things more frightening, end quote. The fact that the Supreme Court has even agreed to hear the SEC case and other cases that threaten the administrative state is alarming. It signals the court's appetite to tear down or at least chip away at a crucial check and balance of the American government. Without the full use of these federal agencies, who prevents insider trading? Who makes sure we have clean air and water, that our food is safe to eat, that our roads are up to snuff? And by the way, this whole effort to dismantle the administrative state would hand even more decision-making power and more responsibility to the Supreme Court and to Congress, a Congress that is notoriously incapable of deciding much of anything at the moment. The question is, do we want agencies staffed with experts in their respective fields to design and enforce regulations for how we operate, or do we want Congress and a few appointed judges to make those decisions? These cases do not have the same name recognition or obvious immediate consequences as other landmark cases we've seen this Supreme Court deliver in the last few years, like the Dobbs decision to end the right to abortion or its decision to overturn affirmative action. But these cases cannot go unnoticed. These are cases that have the potential to upend systems upon which we rely to protect ourselves, our water, our economy, our food, and our planet.
And like Ali Velshi said, that without strict regulation from these agencies and handing them over to the Supreme Court and to Congress, it could have a devastating effect on clean air, food regulation, clean water, safe roads, etc. So far at the moment, according to the article from Vox.com, this case would not become catastrophic for the agency, but it will still be severely weakened from the conservative justices in the court. The oral argument in this case was squarely focused on the 7th Amendment of the Constitution that would essentially prohibit the SEC from using enforcement actions before an administrative forum that does not use a jury. Jarkessi attacked the SEC's decision to bring this case before an administrative law judge instead of being brought before the federal district court in front of an Article 3 judge. Let's analyze real quickly the differences between an administrative law judge and an Article 3 judge. Article 3 judges are political appointees who are nominated by the president and confirmed by the United States Senate. They serve for life and are members of a separate branch of government from Congress and the president. Administrative law judges are in-house at the agencies that bring the cases before them. They are not political appointees, but are civil servants whom are appointed through a merit selection process and are less partisan. These judges specialize in a narrow area of the law. They focus on the kinds of security fraud and similar cases that are handled by the SEC agency. They are familiar with this complicated area of the law. Article 3 judges are not, since their cases are within the areas of federal and state law. There is one other difference between them. Litigants in Article 3 courts demand a trial by jury. Administrative law judges do not. The jury would defeat one of the primary advantages of an administrative forum, the ability to have the case resolved by a subject matter expert. Even though the decision from the conservative Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals feels very much like something out of the former president's propaganda newsletters, the conservatives on the Supreme Court, however, were not willing to overturn the Supreme Court precedent of Atlas Roofing v. OSHA. That decision held that the 7th Amendment does not apply to cases in which the government sues in its sovereign capacity to enforce public rights created by the statutes within the power of Congress to enact. What should be read from the Supreme Court during the oral arguments came from the conservative justices is their advocacy against forced arbitration. They have also dismissed the arguments that private forums violate the 7th Amendment and are unfamiliar with the text of federal statutes as a way to maximize employers' power to avoid jury trials. They have sought to centralize the power within the Article 3 courts against the federal agencies supervised by the president. Chief Justice Roberts during the oral argument made it further explicit about his belief that federal agencies are too powerful and that much of the judicial power should be transferred to the Supreme Court and the Article 3 court. He has characterized administrative law judges as the executive branch's own employees. Roberts' assumption is that he believes Jarchessy's argument for the Seventh Amendment is a good enough reason to shift the power from the administrative law courts to the Article III courts that is led by the Supreme Court. So what would the outcome be from this decision? It would further erode the power that the administrative law judges have when it comes to cases related to federal regulations within the major agencies in the United States government. The federal system of the government will lose the overwhelming majority of its capacity to adjudicate cases, forcing litigants to wait years before an Article III judge has the time to take up their case. In any case, the GOP majority on the Supreme Court appears poised to rule in favor of Jarchesy. This would send a message that cases like his will be sent to the Article III courts where he can receive a jury trial. In the conservative justices' minds, the Seventh Amendment appears to protect hedge fund managers and not workers. While the upcoming ruling will not satisfy anyone that shares the conservative justices' political views, it will be a minor attack on the federal government's ability to enforce the law that will be less brutal and catastrophic than the Fifth Circuit Court's decision in the long run. This has been Allow Me to Explain. You have been listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. This series is now available to listen to at 4 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Radio Public every Friday. And my mini-sodes, Jordan Ramirez Recommends, every Monday at 12 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Radio Public. And just as a reminder to make sure to like and subscribe to my podcast on Spotify. Make sure to go to my blog website at filmtalkwithjordanramirezpodcast.wordpress.com with my latest podcast episode on the page labeled Episodes. You can contact me on my social media feeds such as LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. I am also available on Letterboxd. Check out my YouTube channel as well, Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, and make sure to like and subscribe. If there is a film that you recommend that I would put for my next review, make sure to submit it to my social media accounts, and if you're lucky, make sure that you also recommend your favorite film and also put out your audition video on Instagram or on YouTube to make sure that you appear as a guest star on my next episode on a video podcast. Special video podcast anyway, a special video podcast episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. And until then, I'll see you at the movies.